Loving God, we thank you for those who have gone before us, building the faith in this city. We know that you dwell within us, who are living stones who are gathered together this evening to give you praise. But we especially thank you tonight for the legacy of church buildings they have left in our midst. We bless you for our own sanctuary of St. Martin in the Fields and pray that it may long be a witness to love and justice in our corner of your kingdom. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Well, why? I'm sorry. What is going on? There we go. Okay. So at the end of last week's session, we saw this slide that I think helps drive home the reality that Toronto, a relatively small community of about 30,000 people in 1851, was already incredibly diverse by then, and it had been so for some decades, at least in religious terms, if not cultural. The year 1850 is generally accepted by church historians here in Toronto to mark the end of the missionary period. And it initiates what is called the denominational period. That's because before 1850, there was a certain religious fluidity in Toronto and its surrounding areas, particularly among Protestant laity. So by that, I mean, if there wasn't, for example, a clergyman from your particular tradition handy, it wasn't at all unusual for Protestants to avail themselves of the services of some other denomination's minister, since they shared so much in common at this point, including the King James Bible and a Reformed theological tradition. This time before 1850 was a time when denominations competed for the hearts and minds of settlers. And so what you will find are stories about Anglicans during this period, for example, attending Methodist services on Sunday because an itinerant preacher happened to be nearby, but then insisting on having a clergyman of their own tradition come out to perform marriages, for example, or bury the dead according to the rites of the Book of Common Prayer. Before 1850, Anglican and Presbyterian clergy opposed this fluidity among their people, emphasizing that God, in their opinion, revealed a rational order for society specifically through their church's laws, prayer books, and liturgical traditions. Methodists, on the other hand, they appealed more to the heart traditionally rather than to law and custom, maintaining that a sterile, rule-oriented approach to faith, as you could find in books, well, that was never going to change society for the better. The Methodists insisted that you needed to have a personal experience of God, leading to a personal conversion, perhaps begun at one of their camp meetings, and that it was only by converting a wide swath of individuals that society itself would be transformed. Anglicans and Presbyterians in Toronto rejected that idea, arguing that society only improved when people acted rationally, not emotionally, and that improvement was to be found and achieved through adherence to their respective prayer books, ordinances, laws, and traditions. John Strachan put it this way: the pious Christian, he said, would be a loyal subject, and the loyal subject would be a pious Christian, and this loyalty to the state would be achieved through devotion to the Church of England. This argument about what constituted true religion and how it improved Toronto society would continue to rage well into the middle of the 19th century. Now, there's another reason why the year 1850 is also a good transitional date between the missionary and the denominational period, and that's because it was around that year that the Toronto Anglican Church began seeing new priests coming into the diocese from English universities, and their passage to Toronto and their positions here had been subsidized by the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel back in London. Now, many of these new graduates had been influenced by the Oxford movement, which had begun in the 1840s, and it was starting to have an effect on the theological and political views of Anglicans in England, but also here in Toronto. These Oxford movement priests who were coming over here started taking over important parishes like Holy Trinity by the Eaton Centre. And they were not at all interested in state support for the church, which Bishop Strachan was. That's because they had personally seen how politicians back in England had interfered in matters of the faith that they felt should really have been left to the church's religious authorities. These new priests, however, they did espouse a very strong Anglican identity rooted firmly in the church's ancient history and practice. And they viewed that the church that they served was indeed distinct from all the other Protestants who had been operating in the city to this point. They certainly disagreed with Strawn, who felt that there were no real theological differences, for example, between Anglicans and Presbyterians at the time. These priests also opposed the fluidity that had marked religious life in Toronto and worked very hard to establish parish churches in order to ensure the continuing loyalty of Anglicans to the Anglican tradition. In the decade of the 1850s, 24 new parishes were established in this fairly young diocese of Toronto, helping to strengthen that Anglican identity. Now, not all Anglicans were thrilled about the influence of these Oxford movement priests who had come here, and that led eventually to the establishment, as you probably realize, of Wycliffe College as a training ground for Anglican clergy with more evangelical Protestant leanings beginning in the year 1877. Now, 1850 is also a transitional date from missionary to denominational because of what happened in the 1840s. In that decade, large numbers of Irish immigrants began arriving in town, which we'll talk about in greater detail next week, really. But as a result of this immigration, the Roman Catholic community in Toronto also grew exponentially. Now, as we've seen, Catholic Church officials here had collaborated with the colonial government on a number of issues, but especially with regards to the establishment of public education. But if you were to read letters that were written from Catholic priests here in Toronto from this time period, you would get a sense that they are experiencing a siege mentality here, despite the growth in their numbers. For example, one letter from Toronto's Catholic bishop, Michael Power, written in 1846, asking for money from the Association for the Propagation of the Faith, which was centered in Lyon, France. He gives a sense of that siege mentality when he writes, "Here we find ourselves facing Anglicanism in all of its strength and in all of its vigor. Besides the Protestant cathedral, the Anglicans have 3 more churches. University and collegiate education is in their hands almost exclusively. Its adherents are numerous and rich. The Catholics, although numerous enough, are with very rare exceptions poor, or at least very far from being well off. They arrive, especially from poor Ireland, and usually don't bring anything with them but the desire to work and to earn their living honestly." By 1850, as their numbers grew, the city had to start to deal with a Catholic reality, which was not easy given the strained relations between Protestants and Catholics back in the old country. When Bishop Power died suddenly in 1847, Catholic progress stalled until a new bishop, Armand de Charbonnel, was appointed by Rome and took up residence here in Toronto in, once again, the year 1850. From that year on, with the arrival of the Loreto Sisters, the Sisters of St. Joseph, the Christian Brothers, and religious clergy like the Basilians and the Jesuits, the Catholic Church never looked back in terms of growth and influence as a denomination to be reckoned with in the city of Toronto. But the greatest challenge that all of the churches in Toronto faced just before and certainly after 1850 was the growth of secularism that combined with the growth of industrialization. And this is going to have a direct effect on church architecture in the city, which I'm building up to. It might surprise you to think that secularism was an issue at all in the 19th century, given the impression that we have about how very, very religious the Victorians were. And they were. But by the end of the 19th century, Toronto was already beginning to experience the first serious effects of secularism. Most scholars now believe that that was the result of the great religious diversity in this city that I've been talking about. From our historical distance, we can now detect a general diminishing of influence over public policy by individual denominations in Toronto. Why? Because there was no one single religious group that could speak for everyone. And this manifested itself in several ways. First, it was manifest through the public education system that had been reformed by Egerton Ryerson, which favored no single religion anymore. With the introduction of a non-denominational public system, the role of the clergy, who had been the main teachers in the schoolhouses from the beginning of the 19th century, gradually diminished until the clergy was entirely eliminated from the classrooms almost altogether. Second, Strawn's beloved King's College, which you can see here in a drawing as it appeared on the upper tile. You'll recall that he had established it in 1827 as a strictly Anglican foundation in Toronto. Well, it was secularized by the government and became the University of Toronto when? In 1850, and after a very, very bitter public battle. Thirdly, the clergy reserves, which, as you may recall, originally supported the Anglican Church exclusively. Well, they all went on the chopping block in 1854. After one final payout by the government to the Anglicans and a certain amount to the Presbyterians in that year, a nominal sum was then also paid out to the Wesleyan Methodists. And with that, the subsidization of churches by the government in Upper Canada comes to an end. So this transition from the missionary territory to established denominational life came at a cost, since from this point on, it would be up to the individual churches to support themselves solely from the donations of the faithful and supplemented by appeals to missionary societies back in the old country. Now, for Catholics, this made very little difference since they had never enjoyed government support anyway in this colony. For many of the Protestant church world, however, this leveling of the playing field came as a shock, and it made some of the most important Toronto clergy and laity across the Protestant denominations question the assumption that they had always had, that being that the crown needed the church in order to ensure the loyalty of the people. In response to this new situation, Strawn asked this very important series of questions. He asks, can religious liberty be preserved in no other way than by putting all religions on a level, as equally entitled for support from public encouragement and protection? Are the Quran, the Vedas, the Book of the Mormons, and the Holy Bible to be held equally sacred? And are the public authorities, the organs by which the nation acts, to take any of these indifferently as the rule to direct them in their public proceedings? And in a nation of Protestants who have high and peculiar interest to preserve and transmit to posterity, are all places of power and trust, and even the throne itself, to be open equally to the atheist, the infidel, the pagan, the Muslim, the Romanist, the Mormon, and the Protestant? Is the kingdom of Satan, in whatever shape it may appear, to enjoy the same public favor as the kingdom of God? Is a Christian church, a pagan temple, and a mosque to be equally held in honor? In one word, is the freedom of the city to be bestowed on all the gods of mankind? Well, it appeared that the answer to all these questions was effectively yes. Now, if that weren't all bad enough, in the second half of the 19th century, Christianity, but particularly Protestantism in Toronto and around the world for that matter, had been shaken by the discoveries of Charles Darwin with regards to evolution. But that wasn't all. Even within the churches, there were problems because there were now new methods of studying and analyzing the scriptures that began in the 19th century, began in Germany, that caused many now to question the historical truth of the Bible as it had been understood since the Reformation. So if on the one hand, the Catholics felt under siege in the middle of the 19th century, so now did the Protestants, but for very different reasons. Secularization in Toronto from 1840 through to the end of the century was going to challenge Protestant influence, which oddly enough, now finally brings us to the subject of church architecture in this city. Now, church architecture, let's bear in mind, isn't just a matter of constructing buildings for the practical purpose of creating a worship space. There is meaning behind the design. and construction that reflects scriptural, theological, and cultural principles. And it's been like that really since the 4th century, when specifically Christian churches started to be built. When we turn to the very first permanent, and I stress permanent, Protestant churches built in Toronto in the early part of the 19th century, sadly none of which survives, we'll find that they were mostly built in a style that is called the neoclassical. This style emerged in England in the early part of the 18th century, and it's called neoclassical because it harkens us back to the style that was originally used by the ancient Greeks and Romans for their public buildings. Now, it emerges in England as part of the Enlightenment, that philosophical, scientific, and political movement that began at the end of the 17th century. We have to bear in mind that the English Enlightenment was in many ways a reaction. And specifically, it was a reaction against Puritanism. With the Puritans' narrow and literal reading of the Bible, England had turned into a rather unpleasant theocracy for a little more than a decade in the middle of the 17th century. The Enlightenment which followed rejected this religious and non-scientific approach to life, advocating instead for the use of human reason. Now, among the ancient thinkers from whom Enlightenment architects in England drew inspiration was a man named Vitruvius, a Roman whose theories fueled a passion for neoclassical design in the 1st century before Christ. Both state and church architecture in Britain rapidly adopted his style, communicating the message that the partnership between an enlightened church and an enlightened state was not only possible, but it was necessary. Neoclassical architecture is characterized by a grandeur of scale, simplicity of geometric form, the use of Greek or Roman detail, a dramatic use of columns, and a preference for blank walls. Now, among these, the ones that you may recognize, Mansion House, built in 1739, the British Museum, 1759 and beyond, both to be found in London, of course. The General Post Office, built 1817, and the Bank of Ireland building, 1739, in Dublin. The City Chambers and Queen's Hall, City Chambers built in 1753, the Queen's Hall, 1823 in Edinburgh. These are but a few of the many, many neoclassical buildings that British settlers would have had in mind when they immigrated to Toronto at the beginning of the 19th century and began their own building projects, both civil and ecclesiastical. Sadly, Toronto has preserved very, very few of these examples. The few that still survive of neoclassical buildings in Toronto are Osgoode Hall on the left-hand side, begun in 1829, and the St. Lawrence Hall, begun once again that year, 1850. Now, early immigrants to Toronto would have had this trendy new style in mind when they began their plans for church construction. The neoclassical style, seen, for example, at St. Paul's Covent Garden or St. Paul's Birmingham, to name but two, proved to be incredibly influential on Toronto Protestant church architecture in the first half of the 19th century. But the most influential architectural example of this neoclassical movement is, without doubt, St. Martin's in the Fields, Trafalgar Square, which was constructed between 1722 and 1726. When you look at it, you can see it combines the main features of neoclassical church architecture that we will eventually find in those early Toronto Protestant churches as well. A fairly plain facade, generally of one unifying material, rounded arches rather than pointed windows, the use of pillars and pilasters, and the presence of a triangular pediment over the door or the porch. Now, if there were no steeple on St. Martin's in the Fields, you could very well think that this was a pagan temple. The choice of neoclassical architecture for St. Martin's was not just a matter of chance or taste. It was intentionally chosen to match many of the new buildings that were being associated with government power just down the street in Whitehall, as well as the residences of the royal family, which, let's all bear in mind, are all within the parish of St. Martin's in the Fields. The choice of this new style was sending a very important message. It was linking the church more firmly to the state. At the same time, it represents a rejection of Gothic architecture, like that you would find in Westminster Abbey, and that medieval association with religious superstition on the parts of many. It's also a rejection of the Baroque style that had been emerging by this period, typified by Rennes' St. Paul's Cathedral, because it was felt to be a little too closely associated with Roman Catholic architecture, especially St. Peter's in Rome. But what about here in Toronto? Well, by 1834, Toronto was already being called the city of churches because the large variety of denominations in town required so many different church buildings to be built. It is remarkable to me that in a frontier town like Toronto, just how many incredibly beautiful churches were being erected by this time. The magnificent St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church, which then stood at the corner of Church and Adelaide Streets, just a stone's throw from St. James, was built in 1830 with a spire that was added 10 years later. The church, which you can see here, was built of brick, but then it was stuccoed all over and painted white, resulting in an austere, restrained, and classically beautiful appearance. The tower that you're looking at there is pure neoclassical, and it combines in its structure the famous Tower of the Winds that had been erected in Athens in the year 50 BC, as well as the monument of Lysicrates, also erected in Athens in the year 335 BC. St. Andrew's Presbyterian, Old St. Andrew's, has been described by architectural scholars as precise, carefully designed, rational, and altogether satisfying. And it is an excellent example of neoclassicism with its arched rather than pointed windows and use of pilasters. The next church for our consideration is the Adelaide Street Methodist Church, which was constructed in 1832. Here you can once again see the arched rather than pointed windows, a plain facade composed of one material, simple triangular pediments at the top of the building, as well as over each of the three entrance doors, all combining to announce its restrained and neoclassical style. Now, a split within that congregation led to the foundation of the Wesleyan Methodist Chapel that stood on the south side of Richmond Street between Yonge and Bay, and it was constructed in the year 1844. It was effectively a basilica with Roman Doric columns across the front and an elevated parapet that hides the slope of the roof line behind it. The base of the triangular pediment, as you can see, is decorated with restrained geometrical designs. Rounded arched windows and doors reinforce the connection to the ancient Roman basilica style. Although it was built in Toronto's traditional red brick, it was then painted white to give it that temple-like feeling that you would find in ancient Greece or Rome. Now, it was no longer needed by the Methodists after the construction of a Metropolitan Church on Queen Street, and so it was demolished in 1888, sadly. Zion Congregational Church was erected in 1840 at the corner of Bay and Adelaide Streets. Like St. Andrew's, it was a brick structure that was covered in white stucco. Zion was considered the finest example in Upper Canada of a church that was built in the Greek Doric style, with the main entrance, as you can see, between two freestanding Doric pillars, white pilasters framing the corners of the building. The church burned in 1855, and a new sanctuary was erected on the very same site the following year, and we'll see that momentarily. As for St. James, the second structure that replaced the original simple wooden church was erected in the neoclassical style as well in 1833, but it burned in 1839. After a very rapid reconstruction project, a second neoclassical building was reopened in December of the very same year, but now as a cathedral. Although it lacked the pillars that we associate with neoclassical architecture, it had all of the other expected features, including pilasters between each of its windows that created this 6-bay appearance you can see on the side, a 3-bay entrance at the front. The main door was surmounted by a classical triangular pediment, and all the windows had rounded arches rather than pointed. Now, unlike the other churches that we have encountered thus far, This St. James Cathedral was built of stone, not out of brick. Sadly, the neoclassical cathedral was destroyed during one of the deadliest fires that Toronto had ever experienced that began on the morning of the 7th of April, 1849, at the corner of King and Jarvis Street, eventually destroying 15 acres of the central business district. This event, therefore, of course, necessitated the construction of a new cathedral. And that, once again, brings us to the year 1850, which again marks the end of the missionary period and the introduction of the denominational. But it also marks the beginning of many new church projects in the city besides St. James Cathedral. The difference will now, however, be that in every single case from this point onward, after 1850, the neoclassical style is going to be abandoned in favor of the Gothic revival for all new Protestant churches. So what are the main features of this new Gothic architecture? Well, the principal features are pointed arches for windows and doors, interior rib vaulted ceilings, and decorative elements like porches, dormer windows, and roof gables. You will also find that the roofs of these new churches were much more steeply pitched than you would have ever found in the neoclassical style. Gothic revival churches often feature castle-like towers and crenellated parapets, such as you can see here, both at Holy Trinity Eaton Square on the right and Little Trinity Eaton, on King Street, or high spires like St. James Cathedral, which is still the tallest spire in Canada. What you aren't going to find in these buildings are rounded arched windows, the use of pillars or pilasters, or triangular pediments. Now, before I explain why this is the case, let's just look at the shift in style, congregation by congregation. So side by side here, we can see the old St. James Cathedral and the current building, which was completed in 1856 with porches and tower added later in 1875. With its higher elevation, its pointed windows, and interior rib vaulting, there is no way that you can confuse the new St. James as a classical structure. It is indeed still one of the finest examples of the neo-Gothic to be found in Toronto, let alone Canada. As I mentioned a few moments ago, Zion Congregational Church, like the cathedral, also needed a new building after its original sanctuary burned in 1855. Its replacement was this magnificent neo-Gothic edifice on Adelaide Street. Next, St. Andrew's Presbyterian. The old church had become too small to accommodate its growing congregation, and so in 1876, the congregation moved to a new site where it still stands at the corner of King and Simcoe. Now, new St. Andrew's was built in the Scottish Romanesque style, which, though stylistically slightly different from the neo-Gothic, is still very much a nod to the earlier medieval architecturals and tradition in Britain, including the rose window over the main door. As for the Methodists, they too were on the move, not only physically around the city, but also splitting up within their respective congregations. By the 1860s, the congregation that had worshipped at Richmond Street Methodist Church needed a larger space, and the result was Metropolitan Methodist, which came to be known as the Methodist Cathedral, built in a very neo-Gothic style, opening in 1872 at the corner of Queen and Church Streets. But there is one last ecclesiastical rebuild I want you to see, because I think it helps explain the reason for the transition in Toronto from the classical to the neo-Gothic better than anything else, and that is Bishop Straughn's King's College. As you will recall, Strachan had persuaded the British government to establish Toronto's first university as a strictly Anglican institution in 1827. On the 31st of December, 1849, the government of the colony secularized his university, much to Strachan's dismay. Between the fire that had destroyed his cathedral and the secularization of his university, 1849 had been a very bad year for Strachan and for the Anglican establishment here in Toronto. His response was to establish a new Anglican university called Trinity, which you see here at the bottom, and originally built in the neo-Gothic style in 1851 in the Bellwoods neighborhood on Queen Street, and thereby hangs the tale. You see, this decision to change styles in Protestant church architecture in Toronto after the year 1850 isn't just a matter of shifting tastes, although that's part of the story. It's also, more importantly, about the shift in relationship between the Protestant churches and the state in Toronto, now symbolically going to be expressed through church architecture. The Anglican and Presbyterian churches had for centuries seen themselves as state churches, but that official status had clearly waned in the second quarter of the 19th century, and it came to a real end in Upper Canada once those clergy reserves had been secularized in 1854. Now, the writing had been on the wall long before that. Dissenting churches like the Methodists and the Congregationalists, well, they didn't have the same issues as Anglicans and Presbyterians with regards to the state, but their architectural decisions were also a reaction against the growing secularization and industrialization of Toronto society. The classical architecture that they had all been using when building their original churches here in town reflected a mutual support between the Protestant church and the state at the time that now, in fact, was no longer really a reality in the city. The choice to shift to the neo-Gothic style was an intentional one and was part of a general romanticism for the Middle Ages that we also find in Victorian painting literature. So it was more than just a shift in tastes. By the mid-19th century, the Middle Ages, oddly enough, were being reclaimed by Protestant church designers, both here and back in the Old Country, as the expression par excellence of the last great age of faith, when the church was still very much at the heart of society. Victorian Protestants were wistfully looking back to the Middle Ages, wishing to reclaim that era when religion was a force to be reckoned with. By the 1850s, society was starting to shift away from piety and reliance on scripture to the use of human reason, to dependence on industry and science. The greatest English advocate for this new Gothic style was, of course, Augustus Pugin, most famous as the architect of the new British Houses of Parliament. But he says that the reason why he chose the Gothic style was because in it, we find the faith of Christianity. We find it embodied and its practices illustrated. Symbolically, then, these new Gothic churches popping up all around Toronto were meant to visually reinforce the idea of the sacred in an increasingly secular city. You simply no longer wanted your church buildings to look like the town hall or the legislature or the courts or the market anymore. You wanted people walking on the streets to look at these new buildings and recall perhaps the medieval parish church in which they had grown up back in the Old Country and the faith that was at the very heart of English village life. As a result, the second half of the 19th century saw only Gothic Protestant churches built in Toronto. And as one scholar puts it, all these new Gothic churches with which we are so familiar, buildings, in fact, like St. Martin's, changed the appearance of the frontier town from what had been simple classical lines to the Gothic everywhere. They were described by some contemporary observers as sermons in stone. Now, at least that was the case for the Protestant churches, but what about the Roman Catholic community? Well, there were only two Catholic churches built in Toronto before the year 1850. The first was St. Paul's in what today is Corktown, down around Parliament and Queen. As you can see from this old photograph, the church erected in 1822 was thoroughly Gothic. The windows are all pointed rather than rounded. There is no attempt to use pillars. Building materials are mixed, brick and wood, and there is no effort to make the building look like it was composed from a single material, as we had with most of the neoclassical Protestant churches that either use stucco or paint to achieve that impression. An extended front porch adds to the complexity of Old St. Paul's, which was clearly inspired by the medieval churches of Ireland. The important thing was that should you have walked past this church in 1822, you would have immediately looked at it and said, this is not a Protestant building, and that was the point. The other important Catholic construction project from the first half of the 19th century was, of course, St. Michael's Cathedral, which also rejected the neoclassical style in favor of English neo-Gothic, but about a decade before that style started catching on in the Protestant community. Construction began in 1845, and the building opened for public worship in 1848. And as a nod to Toronto's earlier history as the town of York, fragments from a stone pillar and from the old oak roof of York Minster Cathedral are actually still sealed in the cathedral's cornerstone. As you enter to this day the main doors of St. Michael's, the heads of Edwin, the King of Northumbria, and St. Paulinus, the Archbishop of York, are the very first ones to greet you. It's as though the architect is saying, don't let the Protestants fool you. York's cathedral over there and the new one here are both Catholic. By rejecting the neoclassical style favored by the Protestants, Toronto's early Catholic architects in the first half of the 19th century were being intentionally countercultural. So what happened to the Catholic churches once Protestants started building in the same medieval style as the Catholics had been doing? Well, as you can see from the transformation of old St. Paul's Church, they switched directions. As Protestant churches start to embrace the Gothic, Catholic architecture moves towards a variant of the neoclassical, known as the Renaissance or the Romanesque revival. These Catholic churches are easily identified by their round arches and massive stone or brick construction. Most have towers, squat columns, and decorative plaques inlaid with intricate patterns that you would never have seen in earlier Catholic churches. Since this style is really an imitation of Renaissance architecture, you will also find domes occasionally being used as well. By the 1870s, St. Paul's Catholic Church had become too small for its Irish population. In 1889, a new church with a seating capacity of 1,250 people was opened, built in the Romanesque revival style. To look at it, you would think that you were in the heart of Rome rather than on Queen Street, but that was the point. Through this architecture, the Catholic Archbishop of Toronto at the time, John Lynch, was effectively saying, whenever you look at this building, think of Rome. Our Lady of Lourdes Church on Sherbourne had been established as a parish in 1879, with its neo-Romanesque buildings opening in 1886. Again, it would seem more at home around the Vatican than in waspy Toronto, but that was the point. It was in fact modeled on the Church of Santa Maria del Popolo in the heart of Rome, and other Catholic churches and religious houses would follow suit. The magnificent Loreto Abbey, constructed for the Sisters of Loreto on Wellington Street at Spadina in 1879, sadly destroyed in 1961, would follow the same style, as well as St. Clair's in the West End of Toronto in the Earls Court neighborhood, as well as Holy Name in what is now Greektown on the Danforth, as well as St. Anne's on Gerrard Street near Broadview. Now, that's not to say that Catholic churches during this period wouldn't be constructed in the Gothic style, but it's clear that the Catholic Church went that extra step to ensure that there was not going to be confusion about which buildings belonged to Rome and which belonged elsewhere. So I hope you can see by now that as Toronto was transformed into the city of churches, that the architecture of our various houses of worship represented much more than just aesthetic choices. Statements were being made in stone and brick about those who built the churches and those who worshiped in them, and we still live with that legacy today. By 1893, 90 church buildings stood in a very small area bounded by Front Street to the south, River Street to the east, Bloor to the north, and Bathurst to the west. 90 churches in that space. And 25 of those churches seated more than 1,000 people. 5 Methodist churches alone in the downtown core seated more than 1,500 people each, which gives us some sense of what church attendance was like in those days. John Ross Robertson's description in 1904 of Toronto's Sunday evening streets, while a bit romanticized, captures something of that very active church participation. He writes, "The feathery flakes of snow came thickly down like some white-winged messengers from a purer world than this, as the streets of the city were thronged with people eagerly hurrying towards the brilliantly lighted churches. The chiming of the bells made the air musical as their tones rang loud and clear and sweet. No other city on the American continent presents such a spectacle as is seen every Sunday evening on the streets of Toronto. Thousands of people walk the avenues and thoroughfares on their way to church." It's a lovely picture, but it's not entirely accurate. A decline in church attendance was already noted by the end of the 19th century in Toronto, as industrialization forced families to move out of the heart of the city into the suburbs. The poorest of the poor were often left behind, causing one Methodist minister to complain, "It's in vain that we are erecting handsome buildings and conducting decorous services if we do not reach the unchurched masses." Many of those recently built but underused churches would be destroyed to make way for more factories and businesses as the city changed. Others would be reimagined for commercial or cultural purposes. Much of Toronto's landscape, however, still retains the witnesses to this time of burgeoning growth in church construction. If you're at all interested in learning more about Toronto's lost Anglican heritage, I can't recommend enough the website created by David Harrison that you can find here. Sanctuaries long gone that help make Toronto the city of churches is what you will find. Now, of course, the main purpose of all these buildings was to provide spaces for worship according to the many traditions represented in Toronto, but they are so much more than that as well. The churches were also centers for community life and hubs for charitable activities and social welfare. And that is something we will talk about next week, since, as the Presbyterian theologian Timothy Keller says, the church is a hospital for sinners more than it is a museum for saints. And that's it.
All right, thank you very much. We do have some time for questions before compliments. So I will throw the floor open.
Hi, Ann.
Hi, that last or second last quote you read talked about them going to church in the evening.
That's right. Evening services were very popular. Evensong was an incredibly popular service in the Anglican Church. But all of the churches had evening services, and the Presbyterian churches, Methodist, it was regular thing to have at least 2 sermons on a Sunday. And I mean, let's bear in mind, there was no TV, there was nothing. So, you know, and remember, Toronto, and we'll talk about this in 2 weeks' time, Toronto was among the strictest places in Ontario to enforce the Lord's Day laws. So you couldn't do anything. So going to church was the best entertainment you could possibly have had. So no, very popular. And in the Catholic churches, they would have Vespers and benediction. So it was a very popular thing to do in the evenings.
I remember Margaret Green. She was the wife of Father Lee Green, who was rector in the 40s. And she said that Evensong was where the young people got together and they would go from church to church. And the idea was to try to meet people. And of course, that's how she eventually came to St. Mary Magdalene's and met the rector. And they got married from there.
So Evensong is a dating service.
That's right, it was, yeah.
What is the history of the altar facing east?
Well, that's in the Middle Ages. It seems that if I recall correctly, in the Middle Ages, it became as the rite of the Mass became entirely a sacrificial aspect. Facing east was part of facing towards the resurrected Christ would come from in the resurrection. The second coming would come from the east. We buried our bodies facing the east. It's all this idea that as some priests say, you know, the old who favored the old rite facing God. It's a medieval. It really is a medieval development. The early church, certainly they gathered for the Eucharist, but our impression is, as best we can, that it was more of a communal facing the people kind of activity as in a sacred meal. So it was more a medieval development to turn around and face the people as the sacredness of the sacrament becomes emphasized over everything else.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, what does it mean, Meadows Church?
Which church?
Meadows,
Oh, Methodist.
Meadows?
So the Methodists were a group of very devout Anglicans in the 18th century who were looking for a more personal experience of Christ. And over time, their gatherings, they bit by bit came to be separated from the Anglican Church. Although their founder certainly would never have thought that he had separated from the Anglican Church. He would have thought that he was just, giving a new expression or a renewed expression within Anglicanism. So they become a separate Protestant body. Well, probably by the end of the 18th century, you would consider them a entirely separate Protestant body. In Canada, there are very few now because in 1925, they were one of the founding churches of what became the United Church of Canada.
I see. Okay. But are they still within Protestant?
There aren't very many of them here in Canada. There are a few small Wesleyan Methodist groups, but they're still fairly large in the United States, the United Methodist Church and other groups of Methodism. They certainly still exist in England, and they are certainly still part of the Protestant fold, yes.
Okay, thanks.
Just not so many of them in Canada because of the United Church.
Okay, thank you.
Father, what about the windows? When the beautiful windows that we have now, when did that start?
You mean in general in the church? Well, certainly the Middle Ages is the high point when you find the magnificent windows being put in places like Chartres Cathedral. I mean, even today, if you go to, I think was it Ely that I was in? Ely Cathedral, just outside of Cambridge, isn't it? They have magnificent medieval windows as well that were spared the ravages of Cromwell. So it's in the Middle Ages, you see the introduction of these windows. And of course, they're being introduced as a way of, as some people say, the poor man's Bible. People would be able to look at them who couldn't read the Bible. They were illiterate, but they would be able to look at the windows and see the stories from the Bible. And if you were lucky, have someone interpret them for you. So really, it's the Middle Ages we see them come in. The Reformation, in some parts of the Reformation, of course, they fall out of favor entirely. Sadly, so many get destroyed. But here in Toronto, I mean, certainly you're seeing there's some controversy at the end of the 19th century that you can find in the archival documents in the Presbyterian Church about the introduction of stained glass windows in their churches and organs. Much greater controversy over the introduction of pipe organs, but windows. But having said that, St. Andrew's Presbyterian has some of the most beautiful windows in the city. So I think everybody, and Knox Presbyterian has some of the most beautiful windows in the city as well. So St. Michael's has magnificent windows, as does St. James. So Toronto has never seemed to be, it's certainly among the Protestants by the end of the 19th century, it doesn't seem to be as huge an issue as it would have been at the beginning. So Phil, I don't know if we don't have
Okay.
any,
If we don't have any questions, we can move along to Compline. Now I think we're having some technical issues.
Oh,
So I think Mother Allison is having problems with her sound. So we're wondering if you're able to take the Compline for tonight.
oh, okay. I've got the hymn right here just in case. I keep
Beautiful. Okay.